Good morning, everybody. Welcome. We are live from New York City.
Yes.
Murray Hill, just a couple blocks down from the United Nations headquarters, although you can't see that out the window. And welcome to the Monday morning Introduction to Philosophy and Theory class. My name is Julian.
I'm Jenaline.
And Jenaline edits the transcripts for all of these classes, as well as puts together the ebook based on the classes.
Yes.
And is sort of
answers all things Patreon related.
Jenaline is our Patreon social media guru, so thank you very much for all of that. And thank you for students joining us from around the world today. We're so glad to have you here. We're going to be hosting a 1-hour lecture class, Introduction to Žižek's Theory of Subjectivity. And the title for this class is going to be How to Be a Person, Part 2. Because if you'd like to see Part 1, you can go back to last week's class. Every single class is saved for free on my Instagram, on YouTube, everywhere you can find it. The whole point of this is to make education accessible and open access and free for anybody who wants to join. I think the fact that we have students from literally around the world is proof that this is a dream worth fighting for. So thank you guys for making it a possibility, no matter where you are.
Yeah, and let us know where you are joining us from. We said we're near the UN headquarters. I was disappointed, I have to say, that when we walked past last night, the flags were not out. Because that, for me, is like the iconic image of the UN building, is seeing all the flags out. So let us know where you're watching us from. And we'll be thinking of you.
Do let us know where you're joining us from. It makes us really happy knowing in the comments that you are, that you're joining us from different countries. That's really the ultimate gift that you guys can give us. That's worth more than anything. It really is. It makes us very, very happy. We're also trying to get set up on YouTube unsuccessfully. If you're interested, this is our YouTube
This is our setup. That's here.
So
Probably.
I'll do this while Jenaline does a little Patreon announcement. How about that?
Yes, a Patreon announcement. It is the 28th, more or less, which means you've got another couple days. If you'd like to subscribe for this month of Patreon, you can listen to the audio of this classes. So if you want to listen as a podcast, if you want to listen to the Discord discussion we do, we answer questions like, where should I start? What should I read next? Sharing student projects. So the Discord community's been really amazing to watch it grow and develop. Greetings to Germany and Greece and Florida.
Hello. That's true. All so right. Thank you to all of our patrons from around the world who keep this show on the road, who allow us to travel and keep teaching these classes in increasingly glamorous locations like a tiny little bedroom hotel, which we are saying is in New York.
You're just going to have to take our word for it.
And greetings to all of our students who are joining us from New York. Okay, shall we jump right in at this point?
Yes.
Okay, so this is going to be a 1-hour discussion of Žižek's theory of subjectivity. And along the way, we're going to learn about Lacan, we're going to learn about ideology, we're going to learn about just how difficult it is to be a person, especially in this crazy, alienating world. And that's what we're going to do for the next hour. If you'd like to watch the previous class, it is also on Instagram, on IGTV, or you can download it on Patreon. So if you'd like to become a patron. Why are you laughing?
I'm going to post it today.
Okay, yeah. No, the transcript.
Yeah,
but I mean
the
thing is itself. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Shall we just begin at this point?
Yeah.
There's a Giacometti quote that I feel like summarizes what everybody's thinking, which is Giacometti said, the artist Giacometti. If you've seen him, it's like those stick figure walking men.
The original Slender Man. Yes.
Yeah, the original Slender Man. Giacometti said, "We've gone too far, and yet we've not gone far enough." I feel like that's sort of how we are. We've gone too far, but not nearly far enough. Okay, so Žižek's second most well-known book, the book that comes after the Sublime Object of Ideology, is The Ticklish Subject. And today we're going to be answering the question, why is the subject ticklish? Who is the subject being tickled by? Who is doing the tickling? What does it mean to be a ticklish subject? That's going to be the question that we're answering. In fact, I can answer it very quickly right now, and then everybody can go home and we're just sort of happy. Okay, we have the answer. So who is tickling the ticklish subject? The answer is the objet petit a, the Lacanian idea of the objet a, or you could also call it the little other. Because for Lacan, and he develops this in various stages, but essentially we have the idea of the big other and the little other. And today we're going to explain a little bit what the difference is between the big other and the little other. And hopefully by the end of this class, that will make sense to you. Now, first of all, the objet petit a. The a here stands for other, in French, autre, for the other, the way in which we experience ourselves by means of in relationship to other people. Now, on a very basic level, everybody knows how this works. For example, the idea that when we buy luxury goods, we may be buying them because we enjoy them, but we're also buying them because we're trying to impress not only other people, but an imaginary ideal of ourselves, right? We're buying something because we're buying into the idea of being a certain type of person, adopting a certain lifestyle. And that is more or less what Lacan would call the idea of the little other. The little other isn't the thing you buy, but it's the imaginary relationship you have towards the dream you think you're buying. This is also what advertisements do so well. Like any car company, any advertisement you see on TV, they're not selling you the product. They're selling you the dream of the product.
You know, I feel like insurance company advertisements really play into this whole notion of your life is full of all of these wonderful things, and even if you don't now have a boat, you might someday have a boat, and this will be the insurance that you have for your boat. It's not about having the boat, it's about having the assurance that allows you to buy the boat.
Well, and insurance companies are in a difficult position because they're essentially selling you security for a fear that you have, but it has to be a fear you have related to an aspiration you have. So one day you might be worried about your house burning down once you've bought a house, etc.
Yeah.
Okay, so I mean, this is, if you go back to the idea of advertisements, for example, companies will sell you a dream. They'll sell you the dream of having a car that can take you anywhere, or they'll sell you the dream of having a watch that you can pass down to your children. But what companies really want to sell you is the ultimate dream, which is the dream of you. Companies want to sell you a product that you already are. In other words, they want to sell you an ideal you. They want to sell you yourself. Because the way in which we act within consumer society is that we think that we can achieve our true potential by means of consumption. And it doesn't even have to be conspicuous consumption. In many ways, we think that if we have, for example, an iPad, this is a tool that will allow us to better navigate the daily hurdles of what it means to be alive, from navigating maps or ordering coffee online or making dental appointments, which you have to do increasingly on your iPhone and stuff like this. And so what happens increasingly is that they're not just selling you a dream, they're selling you access to participation within a modern world. And so you can't simply say, well, I'm going to exit this, right, at this point. But let's take it a little step back, because we've got a lot of time to build this up, essentially. So Lacan has a difference between the big other and the little other. And the petit a, the objet petit a, is the little autre. And this exists on the level of the imaginary. In other words, it exists not in a true relationship to yourself, nor does it exist in a symbolic relationship to other. It exists in an imaginary relationship that you have to the other. Now, what does that mean? A purely symbolic relationship to the other would function on the level of politeness, the way in which on a day-to-day basis we engage in purely necessary little lies. When somebody, I said this last week, somebody asks you, how are you? You're not expected to say, well, actually, I'm doing terribly. You're expected to say, oh, I'm doing okay. How are you? This isn't a symbolic exchange, not an imaginary exchange. If anything, it diffuses the imagination. There's very little empathy required for this. On the level of the imaginary, we're engaging with other people as if they have the solution, as if they have it figured out. This is one of the fundamental difficulties about being alive, I think, is that we always think that other people have it more figured out than we do. And this isn't just fraud complex. It's not just saying, well, I feel like a fake. It's feeling like other people have figured out something, like other people have an edge on us, that other people are somehow more complete or more happy or more perfect, even in their suffering, that somehow, even if they're having a bad day, that their suffering means something, that it's a heroic struggle, and that our own day-to-day suffering is somehow just trivial and meaningless and not glamorous, because that's how we go full circle in a society. It's not just saying we admire people for their heroism, we admire people for the struggles that they overcome. And in many ways, we sort of idealize this idea that people overcome struggles to become this mythic figure. It's like Sartre's idea that life begins on the other side of desperation. Well, what if your life never begins? What if life is just desperation and just a constant sense of feeling like the starting gun in a race has been shot and you never really...
You're always trying to catch up.
You weren't even at the you weren't even at the starting line, let alone the finish line. And so one of the fundamental illusions we have about being alive, and what makes it so hard to be a person, is that we imagine that other people have it figured out, but even that what they don't have figured out somehow means something. That what we're doing is trivial, that it doesn't matter, but that other people exist in some kind of narrative structure. And I was listening to an interview from Hank Green, well-known by now, you could say probably most well-known for as a TikToker. And Hank Green, with his brother John Green, started the VidCon conference series. And he said that one of the early VidCon sessions, he was literally the founder and the owner of VidCon as a business. And there were all these other creators present. And he said that throughout the conference, he kept feeling sort of jealous, like he thought other people had things figured out more than him, that other people were more successful, that the other people who were presenting at the conference had an edge over what he was doing. And then he got home and he realized that if you could start your own video conference for creators and you literally invited everybody there, it's like your party, and you still feel like you're outside the party, that's purely pathological, right? At that point, it has nothing to do with reality. It just has to do with the sense that we never feel like we truly inhabit our own life. And it's not enough to say that we feel like we don't inhabit our own life. We secretly suspect that other people do, which is totally irrational. Like on a rational level, we all know perfectly well that other people don't have it figured out, that everybody is sort of adrift on a sea of consciousness. And yet at the same time, we all cannot kick the idea that other people have it figured out, that other people somehow are more real than we are. And so we exist in this terrible binary by which we try to fill out our absence of reality by means of seeking that which appears more real to us. Other people, other people's narratives, other people's lives, other people's purchases. That's the whole point of celebrity culture. It's not that we just idolize celebrities as gods of yore. It's that somehow, despite the artifice of celebrity culture and the media narratives around them, we understand somehow that life feels more real. We admire celebrity because we feel like we've seen them go through their journey and become different people. It's like, for example, when Frank Sinatra sang "I Did It My Way," it's important that he sang it at the end of his career and not at the beginning, because everyone felt like they'd gone with Frank Sinatra through this journey. And this isn't all bad. Remember, this is also fundamentally how empathy works. If you're not empathetic, it simply means that you're too grounded in your own reality. We need to experience other people in some fundamental sense as more real than our own selves. Otherwise, we wouldn't have art, we wouldn't have literature, we wouldn't have movies. Movies are empathy machines. We watch the world literally through other people's eyes. The closest we can come to experiencing what it must be like to be in somebody else's body is to read a book. In fact, you'll find that you will be closer to somebody's inner experience, their life, their struggle, their most intimate thoughts when you read about a fictional character, more so than you may even know about the person closest to you. Like, if you read Anna Karenina, for example, you will have more in-depth psychological realism about the characters, and you'll know more about them than I probably even know about Jeneline. Because fundamentally, to be alive in the world, you have to have walls, you have to protect yourself. And yet books allow us a kind of, I know this is a popular term today, but like a kind of radical empathy in which we really get to look under the hood of subjectivity, precisely because it's false. This is one of my favorite quotes about art and about fiction, that fiction is the lie that tells the truth. And vice versa, you could say that subjectivity is the truth that only tells lies. We only interact with the world by means of a fundamental disconnect with what it means to be in our own subjectivity. You're going to say something?
Well, and I think that part of it also has to do with we're really interested in how people overcome adversity. And I think that that's sort of an aspect of most fictional accounts or even non-fictional accounts is how did you overcome adversity. But we don't want to hear about necessarily the adversity in our friends' lives because we want to try and fix it. We want to try and intervene. We want to try and make it better for them. And there's something about reading about it in a detached way that's like, we're not responsible for resolving it. We're not responsible for fixing someone else.
Yeah, this is something that I did a TikTok about a little while ago, about how when it comes, for example, to male and female communication, it's about also understanding that sometimes you don't have to fix the problem. You simply have to acknowledge that there is a problem. And within Lacanian psychoanalysis, this is one of the four discourses. The discourse of the master is also the discourse precisely of the person, the discourse of the analyst is precisely the one who isn't there to solve your problems. It's the person who simply exists as like, anyway, this is a different class. Don't get me on like different. You gotta keep it like
on the
with
tracks.
it like on the tracks, more or less. And so I want to give you another explanation of what the objet petit a is, because for Lacan, the objet petit a is the object cause of desire, not the object of desire. And this is a really fundamentally important difference. Now, an object of desire could be something like a handbag. An object of desire could even be something like a person. An object of desire for most advertisements, the ultimate object of desire is yourself. We desire to properly inhabit our own lives. We desire to be a person. We aspire, we want to realize our own selves, our own journey, our own narrative. Turn on the TV today and you'll see that most advertisements are simply about the very idea of striving itself. That you have to buy into a dream, and the dream is yourself. However, everybody knows, there's probably nobody in the world who thinks that buying something expensive, retail therapy as it were, is going to make you whole, right? It's not about the object of desire. Instead, it's the object cause of desire. The object cause of desire is what makes you desire. Now, here we have two ways of answering it. One, you could say, well, what makes us desire are the evil corporations who want to create more money by selling us things that we don't need to impress people we don't know. It's creating holes in other people so that we fill an imaginary hole in ourselves. And all of that is true to some extent. To some extent, there is a profit motive. There's an incentive for people to create desire, to stimulate desire, to perpetually make us want more, so that we then consume the next product. There's no reason why you need 100 different shampoos. There's no reason why you need to have 100 different brands of cereal. We have to create desire. It is, in a sense, manufactured desire. But that's a slightly cynical take because it works on a slightly different level as well, which is what is required in order to keep on desiring. In other words, what Lacan argues is that what we desire isn't an object. What we desire is desire itself. That's one of Lacan's most famous ideas. That the thing that we really want is to never stop wanting. And the problem for Lacan is that even if you go down the Buddhist route, which is the elimination of desire, then you simply desire not desiring. And so you've essentially found another way of being someone who is desirous. You are desirous of not being desirous. And so desire for Lacan structures the subject. In other words, we're back at Žižek's idea of the ticklish subject. We are tickled by desire. And yet, at the same time, we don't fundamentally experience our own selves without desire. Desire becomes one of the preconditions for being alive. Now, of course, desire revolves around lack, imaginary or otherwise. A lack is something that you think you are lacking and that you can fill up. And so, when you desire an object, that is an artificial lack. Some companies telling you if you buy this handbag, you will have the thing that you thought you were missing. Well, the thing you thought you were missing was probably desire. It is desire itself that you are missing. In other words, it's not just desire for desire itself. Desire is the ultimate lack. Desire is the other side of the coin of lack. And so what's funny is that you will be amazed how often you buy things that not only do you not need, but you know that you don't really want them. In other words, what you desire is desire itself. And this is why Žižek has the example of the Kinder Egg, the famous chocolate German Kinder Egg, in which you have a chocolate surprise, like an egg, and within that egg, there's a little plastic cone that contains a toy. And Žižek says, here we have the short circuit of desire and lack. When you bite into the chocolate, you are trying to reach the toy inside the chocolate. And yet, as soon as you've opened the toy, you eat the chocolate. In other words, you're not there for the chocolate or the egg or the toy or the chocolate. What you're really there for is the drive, the animating feature of desire itself. In other words, what you want is desire. You want to have the thing that comes next. That's what we want fundamentally. We're not there for the thing, we're for the idea that there will always be a next thing, that we will never stop wanting. And so instead of saying that there is a lack that can be filled through desire, we start realizing that desire is itself the ultimate lack. You were going to say something?
Nothing. I think the bottom of the phone, the microphone is rubbing a little bit.
Oh, is it blocked?
So I don't think it's blocked, but I think when it, yeah.
Oh, when it
Let's
moves?
see.
So should I not move it?
Yeah.
Okay, there we go.
Let us know
Is
if
that
that's
better?
a little bit better.
I think it's just when I move it, yeah.
Okay.
And so what Lacan says is the object cause of desire is that which makes us desire. It's not the thing we desire. And so what happens, the image that Lacan uses is the idea that when you're looking at a stage, you see like a ballet dancer on stage. Shout out to our wonderful friend and patron and learning community member, Paulo, whose performance we just saw in Boston, the principal dancer of the Boston Ballet. Shout out to Paulo, much love. Lacan says that when you look at the ballet dancer, what makes you see the ballet dancer is, of course, the spotlight. It is the light that makes you see, not the stage. And what happens with the object cause of desire is that it is not lack that makes you desire. It is desire that makes you lack. In other words, they're one and the same. They're what create the desiring subject. And this is one of the problems with the sort of anti-consumerist, anti-capitalist critique, which is that as long as we learn not to buy pointless things, we can go back to a kind of pure, authentic subjectivity. Because the idea of pure, authentic subjectivity is itself a commodity that is sold to you precisely by means of capitalism. The ultimate dream isn't buy this watch, buy these clothes. The ultimate dream is buy yourself, invest in yourself. See yourself as somebody worth creating a life story around. And then as you get older and you become a slightly older target demographic, the story shifts towards provide for your next of kin, provide for your children, buy a watch for them, buy a house for them, buy life insurance for them. And so we simply pass on that narrative about our own subjectivity. Are we going too fast here?
No,
Or is-
I'm with you.
I think this is all. Now, we're still at the level of the objet petit a, which is the idea that you are desiring something. And you're desiring something that you think will fill an imaginary lack, desire and lack. It's like the dialectic of presence and absence within theology, but made manifest through commodities. And yet, none of this would make sense. I mean, maybe it doesn't make sense, but none of it would make sense without the governing structure of the big other. And this is also why, if you want to understand what Žižek's theory of ideology is, it can be very, very simply summarized. Žižek's theory of ideology is that ideology structures our desires. In other words, within the big world of desire, the big world in which we are tickled by desire, in which we experience subjectivity by means of desire, in which the objet petit a is precisely the illusion that others are not lacking in the way that we are lacking, that others are more real and more complete than we are, and that this hole can be filled. That whole chaos of desire has to be structured by a governing order of desire. In other words, the way in which objects and others are filled in with desire has to, in some minimal abstract sense, be governed by an order. In other words, the idea of ideology is that which brings order to the chaos of our own desires. In other words, that which teaches us what and how to desire. And here you realize that this is a totally different understanding of ideology from how we learn it in school or political science. In school or political science, we usually think of ideology as being like a political agenda. We have objective, neutral reality, which is given a subjective, usually political spin, so that we see the world suddenly through an ideological lens. And this is why for Žižek it's exactly the opposite. I've said this many times before. Žižek says that the most ideological thing you can do is precisely to posit the idea of an objective neutral reality. In other words, an objective neutral reality in which our desiring isn't structured or given structure by some overarching meaning. Now, it would be wrong to simply say that we live in a world that is capitalist ideology or consumer ideology, right? Because you can't pivot, like you can't posit ideology as being like this, I don't know, the eye of Sauron that sort of like goes around everywhere and infuses the neutral substance of reality with the beam, the gaze of ideology. Instead, we're trapped. We're trapped and stuck with an ideology because if we only experience subjectivity, our own selves, by means of how we interact in the world, how we structure our own governing principle, which is that of desire, then how is desire structured? That is the fundamental question of ideology, which is what structures desire itself? What structures that sense of lack? And so if you will, we have the big other and we have the little other. The little other is how we experience meaning in the world through desire and lack. And the big other is what creates the overarching umbrella in which that play, that pantomime of meaning takes place. Now, in a trivial sense, are you laughing? No?
Yeah, no, I'm with you. You.
No, tell me.
Laughing about the wind. I'm sorry, it's windy.
Oh, yeah, it's very windy through the blinds. I thought you were laughing at me, which is totally legit.
No, I'm not.
Am I going too fast?
Mm-mm.
Or is it still okay? I know we're covering a lot of ground. So, on the level of the big other, right? We said that the big other is that which structures desire. In other words, the way in which we experience desire. Now, you could say, well, what structures desire? Cody without organ says that the wind is the screams of the big other. Now, what's really important for Lacan, and this is something that I want to emphasize here, and for Žižek, is that the big other doesn't exist. In other words, there is no structuring principle that gives order to our desire. It's a retroactive illusion. In other words, in the interplay of human subjectivity and othering and desire and lack, we necessarily need the idea of some kind of governing body, something which gives meaning to everything else. Let me give you a very concrete example. God. Think about the idea of God, for example. God, precisely in his not being present, becomes omnipresent. This is also why athletes can say something like, well, when they're asked, like, why did you score 100 points in this game or whatever, they'll say, well, I just did it for God. I did it for the grace of God. Obviously, they didn't do it for God, who then said, well, thank you, this was such a great game. I will now not smite you. They're doing it because they're acting within the limitless freedom that is given to them precisely by being bound by God. And here we're already at the Nietzschean idea that the ultimate way in which we access freedom and free will, is precisely by means of fate, by means of choosing our own fate. If you say something like, I am now the slave of God, all of the sport I do is for God, all of the art that I do is for God, everything that I do is for God, then suddenly you're totally free. You're free to do whatever you want because you've created this big other, this ultimate umbrella that's very unlikely to suddenly show up. And that has created the house, if you will, of your authentic freedom. This is what Nietzsche means when he says that fate is the ultimate way to access free will. It's the idea of positing a big other in which you suddenly have a structuring order, a narrative in which you have total freedom. It's also why Lacan quite famously, and I think that Žižek also has a couple plays on this, inverts Dostoevsky's idea about God. Lacan says, it's because there is a God that everything is allowed. Whereas Dostoevsky says that without a God, nothing is allowed. Mm-hmm. And Lacan says that once we have this big other, this figure, and this is not just cynical or convenient, but this structuring body of the worldly order, suddenly everything is allowed. Suddenly you can do everything. You can do it for God. Mm-hmm. And this is also sometimes where you get into a very dangerous territory, obviously. Because if everything that you do is out of, for example, love, then suddenly violence can be done out of love. Mm-hmm. We saw for those of you who watch television, yesterday night we saw the Oscars. Jen Lane and I were in the hotel room watching the Oscars. And there was the infamous moment in which Will Smith assaulted Chris Rock, the comedian. And what was so interesting about that whole sequence was the way in which, during his acceptance speech for Best Actor, Will Smith said that you do crazy things out of love. That his act, his assault, a small or large, whatever, act of violence, had been acted out on behalf of love, on behalf of the defense of a principle.
Defense of family.
Exactly. And I'm not saying that this is evil, but this is, of course, Hegel's idea of evil that Lacan then incorporates, which is the idea that evil is precisely that which perceives itself as acting in defense of the greater good. Nobody commits an act of violence by saying, or slap or whatever, like, I'm a terrible person who will now assault other people. No, you assault other people on behalf of everything that is good in the world, on behalf of love itself. That's exactly the kind of contradiction that happens when your free will becomes anchored in an ideal, in the idea of the big other. Of course, we could also say that if Hollywood is the big other for us, desiring subjects who learn how to dream and to be and to act, when suddenly one of the gods on Mount Olympus suddenly acts in a way that seems symbolically to rupture everything we believe about the politesse of celebrity culture, it's a disorienting, discombobulating experience. Hence also why even the gods themselves were on Twitter trying to find out what had just happened. The most... Oh, you were going to say.
Yeah, they weren't tweeting out what had happened. They were trying to understand what happened. And
Yes.
I love this moment of the people who were literally in the room, who saw and heard what happened, went to the internet to try and make sense of what happened.
Yeah.
Like, yeah.
And this is exactly... We were not talking things about this like last week or just in this discussion, which is that the closer you are to the source, to the event, the less grip you have on it. It's also why, like, it's very sad, but many of the refugees fleeing Ukraine spend the entire day on the phone looking at, like, live streams and feeds and Telegram messages about the conflict that they've just fled. That's how we have access to it. When you're in the thick of it, you don't know what to make of it. You have to step away from it. There's a beautiful scene, I hope I'm not repeating myself here, in that Stefan Zweig, the German writer, writes about, where he's leaving Austria by train to Germany at the exact moment that Austria is being annexed by Germany. And his train, going back to Germany, crosses paths with another train that has tanks on it. And as soon as he gets to the station, the first thing he does is he's looking for a newspaper because he wants to read about what he's just seen. And then he realizes, of course, there is no newspaper yet because he was there when it happened. And of course, that's what happened when we were watching the Oscars yesterday and all the celebrities who were there, which is that they were right there when it happened, so nobody else had written about it yet. And this is the ultimate utopian moment. The moment in which the narrative has not yet been fixed. And it is also the most dangerous moment. It is the most dangerous moment because for a brief period in time, the big other is uncertain. There's a crack within the edifice of the big other. That which gives meaning, that which orients our day-to-day how we act, suddenly has a crack in it. And that's utopian precisely because utopia is that where nothing is lacking. In other words, that which appears complete precisely through its sudden emergence of an incompletion. It's the crack within the edifice of the big other that allows suddenly for a potentially new future to emerge. And it's that terrifying moment in which nobody knows what the consensus is, what is the narrative, that can restructure everything. And so if you look at the Oscars as being like Mount Olympus, like the heavenly realm of the gods, suddenly there is a total Unbehagen because nobody knows yet where the penny's going to drop. What is the narrative going to be? And these are people whose entire careers depend on being on the right side of the narrative. And to find that uncanny crack within the edifice of the Oscars itself was deeply unnerving, but also philosophically quite profound. We were all, including the gods, were trying to catch up with the narrative as it had not yet been written. Now, the analogy that you can make here is that this is what happens exactly after an election. When there's an election, or not after, but in the moment of the election, we don't know who's going to be the winner, who will be the next president. We're trying to figure it out in real time. And so, of course, we have these semi-comforting experts on television with large maps who point out the different electoral vote counts, whatever, and they're trying to figure it out. The consensus has not yet been reached. That is the utopian moment, the moment in which the path of the world could go either way. Now, this is totally different from the utopian moment that is presented to you within the object cause of desire, Remember, when you're given 100 different brands of shampoo, every brand of shampoo is supposed to be for the real you, the you that you want to become. And yet, fundamentally, it's a forced choice because you're not getting to choose between the choices itself. In other words, the choices are presented to you predetermined, as it were. And it's only in that moment, that utopian moment in which the big other has a crack within it, that suddenly you start seeing that there could be other choices that have not as of yet been materialized. Now, this is also, and in the comment section we have our good friend Cody here, who's of course ahead of us as per usual, which is that we have here a difference between the psychotic subject and the hysteric subject. Remember, for the psychotic subject, everything is as it should be. Everything is a completely enclosed world of meaning. And this is, in a sense, the complete big other. The big other who appears to us as completely there, completely infallible. When Lacan says that the big other doesn't exist, he's suggesting that we have to have a hysterical stance towards this completeness. And I know I'm not being very, very structured here, but like when Will Smith gave his acceptance speech, he himself had not yet figured out whether this would be a moment of triumph or the end of his career. In fact, we had not figured it out yet, nor had the people in attendance. And so Will Smith had to deliver a speech that would be either the culminating act of a great career or the beginning of a second chapter of a new career. He had to do both. That is hysteria. That is the radical questioning of how do I fit within the governing body. But here we go back to the Unbehagen. Here we have the hysteria within the big other itself. In other words, a God who is hysterical as to his own position within the given order. And so what Lacan's trying to point out by saying that there is no big other, there is no psychotic enclosure in which everything is predetermined according to logic and meaning, is precisely that there is a hysteria within the big other itself. This is also what Žižek has elaborated in his, what you might call theology. It's precisely the idea of a hysterical God, of a God that's constantly trying to fill in his own lack, the ultimate filling in of his own lack precisely being the descent of Christ on the cross, etc. But that's for another class. So ideology. Ideology is that which gives the illusion of a governing structure to how we desire. And we are, as Deleuze said, desiring machines. We understand our own subjectivity by means of desire. In a sense, desire is the cross that we were born to bear. There's no escape from it. Even not wanting to desire becomes desirous for us. Now, what's really important here, to go back to the question that we had at the beginning of the class, Žižek's ticklish subject. Who is tickling the subject? We've already answered this. The subject is tickled by the objet petit a, the little autre. The subject is tickled by desire. And in order to sustain the tickling by desire, the subject has to create the illusion of a necessary, ideal order, that of the big other, which fills in retroactively the meaning and the necessity of his desiring. If the big other crumbles, the governing structure of desire crumbles with it. Again, which is why the utopian element is within the big other, because when the structuring principle of the big other crumbles, when there's a crack within the facade of the big other, suddenly what we should desire and how we should interpret meaning and what is right or wrong and whether it's okay to slap another grown man on stage in front of millions of people, that itself starts to crumble. And that's the utopian element. Suddenly the way in which we inform meaning and ethics and logic and participation and desiring and our relationship to the other, in other words, the world of hysteria, the world in which we make sense of our relationship to others and them to ourselves, starts getting wobbly because there's a crack in the big other. In other words, this is for Lacan the purpose of psychoanalysis, to establish a kind of hysteria within psychosis. In other words, for the governing order of being to disrupt and interrupt within the ultimate order of the big other. The security that the big other provides you to unsettle and undermine it from within. Cody without organs in the chat says, could we call this the event? Yes, but this is for... I want to say very quickly on the event, and we could do this maybe in the Discord, is that Žižek and Badiou have two different theories of the capital E event. For Žižek, the event is symptomatic. It comes from within this tension between the psychotic hysteric subject, the big other and the little other. It's symptomatic. For Badiou, it's something that comes seemingly mystically out of nowhere that shatters and disrupts the harmony that we thought we had between the big other and the little other. Although Badiou doesn't use psychoanalytic language like that. Very much anti-Lacan. But we can talk about that in the Discord chat afterwards. I'd love to do that. The theory of the event. Now, okay, so we've talked about the ticklish subject, right? The ticklish subject is being tickled by the objet petit a. And in order to sustain the pleasure of being tickled, the big other has to govern the house in which the tickling takes place, as it were. But there's also a metaphysical argument to be made here. And thank you for everybody who's still with us, by the way. I know we're like half an hour in. There's a metaphysical argument to be made here. Because remember, Žižek's purpose, as we laid out before, was to do Hegel with Lacan. And what this means is that when Žižek talks about the ticklish subject, he's not just talking about the Lacanian subject, the subject that's being tickled by the objet petit a. He's also talking about the Hegelian subject, Hegel's theory of subjectivity. And Hegel's theory of subjectivity can be summed up as followed. Subjectivity is the ultimate illusion. Subjectivity is the reflection of the self with itself. Subjectivity is the process by which we experience our own self through the act of negation. For Hegel, subjectivity equals negation of negation. I've just thrown a lot of things at you, so let's take a couple minutes to unwind them. Hegel says that there is a fundamental Unbehagen in der Kultur, I know I'm using this a lot, but it just fits, within the edifice of the subject. Now, first of all, why are we referring to it as a subject? Aha, here we have the first metaphysical clue. Remember, the classic metaphysical problem within philosophy, going back to Plato, is the relationship between the object and the subject. The object exists in the ideal world, the world of forms, essence. Subjectivity, being grounded in reality, in the material world, exists on the world of appearances. And so within the classic Platonic metaphysical framework, we have the ideal world of essence and the low copy, the debased form of appearance. Or you could also say the subjective world of illusion, we are all in illusion, and the ideal form of object. And so if you think about subjectivity, remember that within traditional metaphysics, subjectivity is debased. Subjectivity is icky, it's gross. It's everything that is trying to reach the ideal and yet continuously thrown back onto earth. This is the pre-New Testament God, if you will. The God who we have to appease and we have to please because their ways are mysterious and inscrutable to us. One of my all-time favorite skits, you can find this on YouTube, is it's an advertisement for Toy Story 3, I think, and an internet Wi-Fi provider. And what happens is that all the Toy Story characters, they gather together in front of like the modem, which is what was a thing back then. And they have like an elaborate like totemic ritual, like in which they're like doing like a shamanic dance, as it were. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to appease the Wi-Fi, appeasing the Wi-Fi, because the Wi-Fi, the internet, exists on this transcendental plane that structures and gives meaning to everything, because unless we have our phones, we can't look up everything and what it means, right? Even as it's happening to us. What does this mean? Do I have a deadly disease? I just coughed. Does this mean I'm going to die? And so they have to appease the Wi-Fi to sustain the network of meaning. The network of meaning being, of course, that which is sold to you as a product, namely a more stable internet connection. It's a beautiful convergence of like a lot of metaphysical ideas and Lacanian ideas about desire. And this used to be a joke within my family, which is that you guys are probably too young for this, but like our internet used to cut out all the time. It was just something that happened a lot. Like nobody really had stable internet connections. And so if you lived in a family, a household, you would start checking with other people. Did you just lose your internet too? Of course, you'd be in a righteous fury if they had a connection and you didn't, you know, like, give me your phone. I need to keep calling my whatever. And the whole point was that in our family, we used to joke. We used to say, we must appease the Wi-Fi, like pray to the Wi-Fi because the ways of the Wi-Fi in the cloud is totally inscrutable. That is the classic metaphysical divide in which us poor mortals are at the mercy of an inscrutable, unknowable, divine essence of being. And subjectivity is a fall from grace. Literally a fall from grace. Grace being that which is in the sky and has perfect Wi-Fi all the time. And that is the traditional metaphysical divide that Plato sets out. Hegel has a crack in this. A very deliberate crack. And if you go back to the previous classes, you'll know how that's also building upon Kant. Hegel essentially posits that there is no essence without the fall into appearance. Now, I want to stress very quickly that this is not the Feuerbachian idea that God is simply like a convenient projection of our own animated souls, as it were, that we need a God to believe in and that our energy of belief has to be put into an otherworldly abstract idea. That's not what Hegel's arguing here at all. Hegel is very much a Christian thinker. He's not disputing the existence of God, capital G. Instead, what Hegel is arguing is that subjectivity is the animating vehicle for essence. So that rather than being a fall from grace, subjectivity itself is the precondition for grace, for essence itself. And what Hegel is essentially arguing here is that essence and appearance aren't divided, but the essence emerges within appearance itself. In other words, that the subject, being that which is incomplete, is the only site in which essence emerges. This is a very Christian idea that grace exists within each and every one of us, and yet we have no access to grace in and of ourselves. We have access to grace by means of a community of other human beings who struggle and suffer and fail. That is what grace is. That is where grace comes through. It comes in through the cracks of humanity itself. We are not simply the lost tribe that is detached from the Father. We are the lost tribe that finds the Father within us. This is why it's so crucial when in the New Testament Jesus says, "Where there is love between you, you will find me." I'm not out there, high up in the sky. I am already here with you. And of course, that's what love is, ultimately. Love is precisely saying, love is there where you think that it is not. Love suddenly comes. It's a spark. It's a fire. It's something that shouldn't happen and it happens. There's something uncanny and disruptive about love in that sense. Love doesn't emerge because everything fits. Love emerges and you say, why do I like this person? I never thought this person would be my type. Anyway, so what Hegel is essentially positing here about the idea of essence is that part of what it means to live in the world of illusions, part of what it means to live in the cave, is precisely to think that essence is out there. And that in fact, essence is in here. Essence is precisely within the world of appearances and illusion itself. That it's a necessary deviation. That the fall comes before the thing. This is Žižek's teleological gesture in a nutshell, which is that it's not that you have something that was essential from which you had to fall into debased material reality. It's that essence appeared retroactively through the fall itself. We've talked about this at length, so I'm not going to go into it too much here. And so the Hegelian subject, as I said, is the subject of the negation of negation. What is being negated and why? Well, within the Humean framework of subjectivity, the one thing that is pure is you. This is kind of like a very modern notion of subjectivity. In a world of illusion, in a world that is structured by manufactured desire, the only person you can trust is you. You are the uncorrupted site of pure, true authenticity, and so on and so forth. And that as long as you learn to guard yourself against others, you can govern yourself. This also goes back to Aristotle. This is also why I think it's Aristotle. Maybe I'm creating a straw man argument. It could be Plato, who says, no, maybe it is Plato, who says, you can either govern yourself or be governed by others. This is the classic idea of subjectivity that fits perfectly well within like a conservative self-help framework. And it is ultimately fundamentally bullshit. The idea that you are an island unto yourself and that if you hold off the disruptive, corrupting influences of other people, that you will somehow emerge as a better self. Now, of course, we all have to learn to set boundaries to what we give to others. We have to learn to set boundaries as to what other people can demand of us, both from our time and our empathy. A relationship is a fundamentally selfish experience because you say, I'm going to give myself to you and hope that you give yourself to me so that I have a convenient excuse not to have to give myself to others, right? There's always that. We have to learn to govern ourselves. Discipline is required for freedom, creative limitations, and so on and so forth. I will never dispute that. And yet the problem within the idea that you can either be governed by others or governed by yourselves is the fundamental illusion that there is an island in which you govern yourself detached from the other. Ultimately, this is the Lacanian idea of psychosis, that you exist in a world that is not governed by the other, that your desire is not structured by the perceived fullness of the other. The idea that you can either be governed by others or governed by yourself is fundamentally intellectually misleading, precisely because it suggests that others have a stake in governing you. It's a cynical take. It's essentially positing that you have to step outside of ideology because ideology is where you end up becoming corrupted by other people, etc. Now, to go back to Žižek's ticklish subject, there is a third reason it's called the ticklish subject. Remember, the first one was the subject is being tickled by the objet petit a, by desire, the desiring subject. Secondly, it's the Hegelian subject of negation, which I will actually return to in a moment because I realize we haven't finished explaining it. Thirdly, the ticklish subject is the quote-unquote elephant in the room, the thing we're not supposed to talk about. The ticklish subject is we don't talk about Bruno. Within, let's say, postmodern, post-structuralist thought, we don't talk about Bruno is we don't talk about subjectivity. We don't talk about the subject existing as an ideal form. Instead, the subject is a social construct. The subject is created. It is conditioned. We manufacture consent, as Chomsky put it, or as Foucault puts it, we have discourses that govern us by the way in which we speak. Lacan's structuralism is simply the idea that we take Heidegger's expression, which is that language is the house that we live in, and he says language is the prison that we live in, right? The idea that subjectivity is something that we have to guard against the constant manipulation of others, that you can be governed by yourself or governed by others. That is the ticklish subject, that we exist, and this is also identity politics and body politics and everything revolving around the finding of an authentic, true expression that is both resisting the corruption of public discourse and contributing to it. Althusser's theory of ideology is this kind of suspicion of the subject. It's that we are interpolated as subjects, and that if we learn not to be interpolated by so-called ideological state apparati, such as the media and the police, we will be free, emancipated subjects. This kind of suspicious, if you will, right, the suspicion of subjectivity, the idea that subjectivity is the ultimate battleground for state power, that is also what Žižek means by the ticklish subject. Because Žižek does something very taboo, and you'd have to spend a lot of time reading about this stuff to realize it's taboo, which is that Žižek is saying, I want to go back to a Cartesian subject, towards a self-transparent subject. That is totally taboo within the idea of structuralist, post-structuralist thinking, in which the idea of the Cartesian subject is the ultimate villain, the ultimate boogeyman against which we have to fight. That the Cartesian subject is capital T, the man, or capital M, right? And so what Žižek is arguing is quite taboo, but he knows it's taboo. And so literally on like page 2 or 3 of the ticklish subject, he says, I want to go back to the Cartesian subject, the self-transparent cogito, I think, therefore I am. And yet I want to do it in a way that shows that the only part of the self-transparent subject that is self-transparent is his not self-transparency. It's essentially a cop-out. But it's a Lacanian cop-out, which is, remember, Lacan, as the structuralist, said, the only thing that is universal is difference itself. The only thing that doesn't succumb to difference is difference. The governing principle of that which is complete is its own incompleteness. The only thing that is truly complete is incompleteness. The only thing that is truly universal is the particular that succumbs to the universal. In other words, we're back at the Marxist idea of the part of no part, or the universal, the singulier universel, the particular that contains the truth of the universal. The universal essence succumbs, disintegrates into a kind of subjective, like, particular, which contains the truth of the essence. In other words, I know I'm being very theoretical, Žižek is saying, I want to go back to the Cartesian subject precisely to show that the essence of the self-transparent subject exists within the barred subjectivity of Lacanian desire. That's basically Žižek's argument. So it's provocative, but it's provocative only for those people who are provoked by relatively abstract, theoretical taboos, as it were. One of those being the idea of the return to the Cartesian subject. Because literally, if you read any of like Foucault's work, the whole point is to resist this idea of, you know, the subject that is either governed itself or governed by others. It's resisting that. There's a lot of, as Cody put it, the howling of the big other outside. It's pounding at the windows, isn't it? It's windy here. Okay, so I wanna wrap up here on a couple of things. I was going to explain why Hegel said that the subject is the subject of negation. Within the classic Humean idea, the idea of subjectivity that is not being corrupted. So it's either you corrupt yourself or you are corrupted by others. That's the idea, right? Hegel said there is no a priori subjectivity. There's no subjectivity an sich. There is no subjectivity to begin with. This is also like the beauty of the idea of like, literally years ago, I think I joked about this in a class, in statu nascendi versus in status nascendi. In statu nascendi is the nascent state of being born, erupting into the world, suddenly being there. Like, there's a reason baby cry. The biological reason is they need to learn how to breathe. The existential reason is they are doomed to a life of, feelings, of feeling things all the time. That is what it means to be alive. And in a weird way, we reenact this every morning when we wake up. Every morning when we wake up, we have this like blissful moment. And I'm not a good sleeper, so I don't think that sleep is... People who say that like sleep is like the cousin or the brother of death, they sleep differently from how I do. I'm more alive in my head when I sleep than when I'm awake. But anyway, when we wake up, we have this momentary rebirth. Every single day, it's like a tired cliche. Every single day is a new dawn. It's a new birth. But there's a kind of fundamental truth to this, which is that every single day we wake up and we feel once again like little babies wailing because it's like, I have to be a person again. Every single day we have to pick ourselves up. Ooh, the sunlight just came in. This is excellent. This is a little moment of sunlight. We have no ring lights here. we never use a ring light for anything. Okay, and so the idea here is that for Hegel, subjectivity isn't this pure thing that emerges at the moment of birth. Subjectivity is what emerges retroactively through the impossibility of being. In other words, the truth of subjectivity in a very like Heideggerian way isn't in being an sich, it's in becoming. This is also Sartre's very poetic idea that I quoted before, that like life begins on the other side of desperation. And desperation is the moment in which you are born. It's having to take control and agency of your own life. It's the process of having to be a subject. You can't just be a formless blob who is just at the mercy of everybody else. That's what it means to be in uterus. And so you go from in statu nascendi towards in status nascendi, which is you have to have a symbolic relationship to the world, which requires an imaginary relationship to yourself. Who am I? What am I doing? Why am I doing it? What's the meaning of my doing? Do I buy things to fill an imaginary hole in myself? Do I help people to make myself feel useful? Like, everything you do comes back to, how do I perceive myself in the world? It's the question that we try to answer every single day. Who am I? What am I doing? It's a classic existential point. And so we can find pleasure in negation. We can find pleasure in giving love. We negate our subjectivity on behalf of someone else. This is why for Lacan, subjectivity means two things. I am both subject and subject to others. This is a classic Christian motif. Be subject to someone else. You find freedom within your own, in a sense, dispossession of your own subjectivity. And here we're at the classic Hegelian divide between master and slave. Remember when Nietzsche says that the ultimate way to access freedom and free will is through fate? For example, now I can do everything because God exists. Now I have a structuring order to the world of desire because there's no crack within the order of the big other. That's what Hegel already has in mind here, which is that your subjectivity emerges precisely through negation. I give myself to the purpose of loving you or teaching you. I give myself to the glory of God. I give myself to the project of generational wealth. I give myself to some other. In other words, I relinquish a kernel of my own freedom and free will on behalf of an ideal, a future self, if you will. And therein I find the staging ground for my own freedom. That is the first negation that Hegel has in mind. So it's not just negating by means of saying that you breathe air and you negate it, or you exist and you're winding down the clock of life, which is a form of negation of your own temporality. It's not just, kill or be killed. It's not just govern or be governed, which would be a kind of vulgar negation. It's precisely the idea that subjectivity is a paradox, that how to be a person is precisely learning how not to be a person, how to disinvest yourself on behalf of an imaginary you, an imaginary future, an imaginary other, whether it's kids, whether it's a relationship, whether it's wealth. You go from in statu nascendi to in status nascendi. And so the paradox and the bind that we're stuck in is precisely this idea that the access and the precondition to our own self, how to be a person, exists in the act of opening ourselves up and giving ourselves as a person to something or somebody else, some higher form of being. That is the paradox of what it means to be alive. And so when Hegel says that subject is not pure an sich, subject is the negation of negation, Hegel's making a chiasmic argument. Rather than having, for those of you who are familiar with the chiasm, it's A, B, B, A. It's a classic rhetorical structure that also works as a philosophical logical principle. Instead of saying we have A, subject, that is negated through others, in other words, you govern yourself or you govern others, and then you have the idea of like, you fight against the governing of others and you end up in pure subjectivity. You have the idea that subjectivity emerges in the middle, through the negation of negation. In other words, I'm not explaining this very well, but there is no subjectivity an sich to begin with. A is hollow, A is empty. B is the negation of being born, of being in the world, in statu nascendi, of suddenly being there in relation to others. And through the X of that, I am here and others are here, you emerge into the BA, which is the now I am negating on myself on behalf of others. I am someone who exists for others. I am tickled by the desire created by the appearance of there being no lack in the other, as Lacan would put it. We emerge back at A, which is subjectivity. And what's important here is that subjectivity doesn't exist on either poles. It's not in the beginning there was A, from which there was a fall into being, from which there was an emergence back into becoming, which leads us back into the A of subject. No, it's that the X, the impossibility for Lacan, the barred subject, between being and not being, between subject and object, between experiencing subjectivity by means of divesting yourself on behalf of a governing logic of being, in other words, the other or the big other. Subjectivity emerges in the cracks. Subjectivity emerges precisely within that impossibility. A, B, X, B, A. Subjectivity is the X. Subjectivity has one form of completeness, which is that it is fundamentally incomplete. It is completely incomplete. And so we're back at the Lacanian idea that the one thing that doesn't fall into difference is difference itself, that the only universal is precisely difference. This is how Žižek takes the idea of Lacanian psychoanalysis and merges it with the Hegelian idea of the subject being the subject of negation of negation. Now, in the past week, we talked about the subject being the subject of the unconscious, which is how you can make the link from that to Marx. So if you really want to get the full picture, make sure to go back to previous week's class and see these as How to Be a Person Part 1 and How to Be a Person Part 2. So, what we've covered in this class, and apologies if there weren't like enough like movie references and jokes, etc., but I hope you've enjoyed it. What we've done in this class, if we've taken the question, who is the ticklish subject and who is the ticklish subject being tickled by, which is the idea of Žižek's second book. And we've said on the one hand, we have the subject is tickled by desire, by the objet petit a, the Lacanian subjectivity, the subjectivity that experiences itself by being immersed in the world of desire, which is governed by the big other which doesn't exist for Lacan. We explained why that is, using examples from the Oscar ceremony last night. And then we related that to the Hegelian subject, the Hegelian subject being the subject of the negation of negation. And hopefully now you can see how Žižek takes the Hegelian subject and the psychoanalytic Lacanian subject and finds like a, what is the meme? I think it's like on TikTok, which is, we will now form an alliance. Lacan and Hegel form an alliance. That's what Žižek does, essentially. All right, I think that's it.
I'm with you.
I know this was a little bit technical, but for me it's enjoyable, and I hope that it's valuable. We have one rule here, which governs everything. We hope that these classes are never self-indulgent. In other words, they don't exist to make me look clever, which would be crazy because I'm not. False modesty is always a good way to end. Secondly, it should be a gift. Hopefully you guys see this as a gift, which is the gift of a class, the gift of sharing a space, a learning community. You guys see it as a gift of just trying not to be pretentious. I want this to be the least pretentious form of communication, if possible. That's like, I know it's a bit dramatic, but like we're literally like, this is us unfiltered as we can be. And so I want it to be that there are things that I care about, that I'm passionate about, which is the idea of philosophy and critical theory and continental theory and Žižek's philosophy and Hegel and Lacan. And I'm trying in the most unfiltered manner to hopefully share that passion with you. And if we can create a community of people who are passionate about similar things, then I feel like we brought a little bit of grace into the world ourselves. So thank you guys so much for being here this hour.
Yes.
Jenny and I are going to take a little break. Then we're going to host a bonus Discord session in which we take your live questions and we talk more about anything you want us to talk about. Any last things you'd like to say? Okay. Sounds good.
That's it. Thanks for joining
Big
us.
thank
Have a
you
great
to
week.
everybody
Thanks for
watching from
starting
around
your
the
week
world.
with us. Yes.
And thank you to all of our patrons who keep us going. All right. Mwah! Thank you guys. See you next week.